Hi class, so I just want to spend a little time talking to you about essay number one and about your purpose in that essay because looking at a few drafts and looking at, and just thinking about what typically students do when they approach literary analysis for the first time, I just wanted to go over a few things that might help you improve those papers. The first is the difference between summary and analysis and interpretation. And a summary is something where you just simply tell your audience what the story was about. So if I wanted to do a summary of like photograph from September 11th, I would say it's about a photograph from September 11th, right? But if I were going to go deeper in that, I might start summarizing what happens in each stanza, just saying, first it describes the image and how people were jumping from the burning floors. And it's very easy to do this and sort of throw some quotes in, and have that be the majority of your paper. And you really want to avoid that. And what you're trying to get at is either analysis or interpretation. And how you do that is, if I asked you, what is this poem about? Or what happens in the poem? And you answered it, you'd probably be doing summary. Whereas if I ask you, what does this poem mean? Or what is the significance of this poem? You probably get at something more like analysis or interpretation. Now, there are different ways to get at analysis or interpretation, and I've given you a way in to analyzing the poem by asking you to choose a poem that was personally significant to you. However, what I don't want you to do is to simply go through and talk about each line and how you reacted to it, because I am also asking you to interpret the poem. So your own personal experience is just a way into the poem, a way to understand the emotions, perhaps, of the poem. But that's not the only thing there is. So, other ways in to get at the analysis of a poem, I gave you some of them, talking about tone and talking about the speaker and addressee on the PowerPoint. But I also wanted to just mention a few more and then give you some examples from the poems you're actually working on. So the first is images, and since I was just talking about photograph from September 11th, it's really appropriate to talk about the fact that this poem is an image. The whole thing, it's describing an image from an outsider's perspective, looking at a photograph that has been printed after September 11th, a photograph of people jumping out of the burning towers, a very famous photograph. So you don't need to do any research for this assignment. In fact, I would really like it if you didn't. And instead of trying to figure out, oh, why would this poet care about that, you need to figure it out through the words that they've given you right there on the page. So if I take a look at this poem here, I see the end. The poet, or the speaker of the poem, says, I can do only two things for them: describe this flight and not add a last line. So then I need to look at that specific language about this image. Why provide this image? Well, for some reason, it was important to the speaker to describe it. And maybe I can assume that the speaker is a poet because they're referring to their poetry here in these last two lines, and not add a last line. Well, why not? And that seems like an important or weighted line, so I could look at it, and there is a last line. So what would the last line be that's missing? What is this void? And that's just me looking at a couple of lines just a little bit without even providing any explication there of what I think the last line would be. And so you see, each line I need to look at that specific language. One of your learning outcomes for this class is to recognize, identify multiple meanings and perspectives in language. Multiple meanings is really important, and the idea that there are multiple meanings is extremely important for literary analysis. What I hear students say sometimes is, how can I analyze this? How do I know what the author was thinking? Well, that's not the goal. It's not the goal at all to figure out what the author was thinking. When someone publishes a poem, they've put it out there in the world to let readers interact with it in however they interpret it. And it becomes less a question of what did they intend than what did they produce. Because we often intend things as writers, and they don't turn out that way. I mean, whether that's academic writing or creative writing. And so what we have is a product that has language and images and all these things. And as readers, you approach it and interpret it in its meaning to you. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to make it all personal. I think that, I believe that. You're just going to provide what you think is a valid interpretation, and you use the text as your support. So in English 101, you would write point, support, paragraphs. You have a point that works to prove your argument, and then you have support for that point that comes from your sources, right? So if I'm making an argument about why we should conserve water, I might say something about how rainfall has decreased in the Southwest. And so, particularly in California and Arizona, we need to be aware of how we would, of our water consumption. And then I would have all of my facts and statistics that I had gathered from my sources to support that that was a true thing I was saying, that that was a valid point, a valid interpretation. And you do the same thing when you're interpreting literature, it's just a different kind of statement, right? So I might say that I have decided that the meaning in Photograph from September 11th is that we should respect the dead by not, by, you know, we should be respectful of the dead by not adding the last line. That Szymborska wanted to be respectful of the dead by not adding the last line. It's kind of a simplistic interpretation. But then you would use the poem itself to support that. Let's look at some other poems with multiple meanings and perspective and in language. If you think about Mark Doty's poem, I'm looking for it here in my pile, Charlie Howard's Descent. So through this whole poem, he's talking about falling. And this is essentially kind of an extended metaphor because he's literally falling, right? The situation of the poem, what the poem is about this kid who's been made fun of because of his homosexuality. He is pushed off of a bridge into a river and he falls and he dies, right, by these other kids. And so literally during the time of the poem, he's falling. The speaker here is Charlie Howard. It's in his voice. This is not the author, right? We know that because the author's name is not Charlie Howard. But it's, you know, it's about this one experience, but also this idea of falling that's carried throughout in lines like, over and over he slipped into the gulf between what he knew and how he was known. What others wanted opened like an abyss. So here, the falling is not only literal, but it's figurative, right? He feels like he's falling into the stereotype that others have for him, falling into the gulf between what he knew about himself, knowing who he is, and how he was known. So the river that he's falling into is that gulf between it, where he can't be either of those things anymore. He knows he can never be his true self, but he also knows he can never be the thing, or he can no longer be the thing that the place where people have put him, that he also figures, he uses figurative language again, as a room with furniture that's familiar, even though it's not how he identifies himself. It's become his identification. So the whole thing is figurative. A similar thing happens in Baca's poem, in Immigrants in Our Own Land, and part of the job of Baca's poem is to figure out what kind of immigrants we're talking about here, right? And even just the title of this poem, you have to read through the whole thing and sort of figure out, where are these people? Is this just one people? Is this many people? Are we talking about literal immigrants? Are we also talking about immigrants in another sense? And that's the work of the poem, and you need to look at each line individually. And that's, you know, poems are short. That's why I assign them first, is because you don't just read it once and then write your paper. You need to spend time with it. You need to write in the margins of it. You need to do all of these things that are really the work of interpreting poetry. We've also got symbols. And a symbol is a type of figurative language, and a symbol is something like William Blake has a poem called The Sick Rose. In The Sick Rose, it's all about this rose that's sick, right? Big surprise from the title. and it describes the rose and it talks about the worm coming out of the rose, right? When we read poetry, we don't really want to say, oh, it's just literal. Well, this poem is about a rose that is decaying. Well, sure. But I think it's pretty obvious when you read the poem that that rose is also a symbol for something else. And a symbol, it's not like there's a magic key that you figure out what the symbol means and then you've got the key to the whole poem. That's not the way it works. Symbols change and mutate, and it could be one thing in part of the poem, the tone could change, and it could be something in the other part of the poem. And that's why you have to look really closely. What is this symbolic for? And is it the same? Does it stay consistent throughout the poem? Other types of figurative language, metaphors or comparisons. My heart is a stone. That's a metaphor. Symbols or similes, which are metaphors using like or as. Personification, which is when you take something that's non-human and give it human characteristics. And there are other types of figurative language as well. When the language doesn't just mean what it is, right? And just language is important. Here's another example. So we'll look at the rest of these poems now. So if we take a look at The Woman Hanging from the 13th Floor Window, we've got this word hanging. And what the heck is that? Is she literally hanging? In what other ways is she hanging? And that works sort of the same way as falling does in Mark Doty's poem. A couple of examples in Song of Napalm and Rite of Passage, and just the simple importance of one word in a poem. So in these first few lines of Sharon Olds' Rite of Passage, she says, "As the guests arrive at our son's party, they gather in the living room. Short men, men in first grade." Men in first grade? I mean, how often do you hear first graders called men? So is she just saying that because, why didn't she say boys? Why is it men in first grade? What does that one little word have to do with the significance of the entire poem? And I would say it has to do with a lot. And how you notice that is that that doesn't sound right. You wouldn't normally say that way. So we see that it's significant. And you got to go through the whole thing, even the next line with smooth jaws and chins. In comparison to what? Why is she giving us that detail? Is that important? Of course it is. So you have to go through each of these lines and figure out what the significance is to the meaning of the whole poem. Okay. Song of Napalm, same thing. He's talking about this situation in the present where he is he's seeing a storm and the horses out in the grass, and then he has a flashback. And normally a flashback would be in the past tense, right? But he says, but still the branches are wire. And just that word are, the present tense of that verb right there, tells you a whole lot about the kind of flashbacks that this particular narrator is experiencing. And, just one word changes the meaning of the poem. A lot of times the last few lines, like in Nicole Cooley's Compendium of Lost Objects, she says this is an installation for dismantling, never seen again. The fact that she uses the word installation is very important. What is an installation? What is she talking about? Never go over a word because you don't understand what's going on in a poem. That means it's a very important place for you to do some work to figure out what's going on. And you can do that work with your dictionary. You can do that work with the reference to the other parts of the poem, the context. But it's very important not just to skip over it. Is she talking about an art installation? Is she talking about the installation of a refrigerator? What is she talking about? For dismantling, never seen again. What does that mean? Does that mean, it could mean a lot of things, and I'm not going to try to give it away, but those are important lines. What does it mean? Okay. The very first line in Letter Composed During a Lull in the Fighting, we've got a metaphor, and I tell her I love her like not killing or 10 minutes of sleep. Let's think of another romantic poem. A lot of people are like, oh, this is a love letter, right? It's a romantic poem. Well, yes, but let's think, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, etc., etc. I actually know that whole poem, but I got stuck there. But shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Well, that's a pretty typical thing you would compare someone to if you were in love with them, right? I love her like not killing. Is that something you would expect in a love letter? Oh, honey, I love you like not killing. Or I love you like 10 minutes of sleep. Well, those few words say a lot more than what they say, right? Um, this is a very small poem, so you really have to do work at the word level to figure out what is the significance of those words.